All right, now it's on. Says it's on. You got it? So you going to drive? Okay. All right. Well, it's good to be here. Good to be here with you tonight. Good evening. I had a full day today and had funeral at Lawrenceburg today. Miss Marston, right, is the name. Her daughter, Brenda Coleman, is one of our members at West 7th. And so that was in the middle of the day, and good to be there and honor her life and be a part of that. The weather got pretty rough. From Mount Pleasant to Lawrenceburg was about 30 mile an hour at the best driving, and so we made it to Lawrenceburg and stopped and ate and came on, but a lot of lights out and a lot of emergency vehicles going through Lawrenceburg, so I do hope that that's not major and no loss of life or injury in that storm, that situation. Carter, our son, called right before we got here, and they've got tornado watches or warnings, one of the two, out in Huntsville. And weather's bad enough there that they called or texted or communicated to people at Mayfair to stay home tonight. So you know how those heathen churches are. I'm kidding. It is good to be with you. The lessons primarily from here on out are going to have to do more so with parenting, even though tonight we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about marriage and how it's affected when children come along. And so a lot of what we'll talk about tonight has to do with marriage. And I think I'm going to shift things a little bit. And in fact, I've put a lot of work into this lesson tonight. May not seem like it. I hope it does. But I've got a lot of material, and so I think that if I go about as far as I probably need to go, then instead of trying to force it all in tonight, I may pick up where I left off next week and crowd some of those last two lessons, the titles that I gave to you, Johnny. And that might be good too, especially since the weather's the way it is and the crowd's down. That'll allow us to review next week, and hopefully those who are not here because of weather will not miss as much. We're talking tonight about parenting in the early years. So you're going to drive completely, right? Or you want me to try it? All lights supposed to be on, right? It'll help me if we can get this working. That way I won't have to try to remember what's next. Okay.
One more time. Now you got it on the flip the dip switch on for me.
Up or down?
Should be down. Now, other one.
All right, one on the right. I've got no lights on. Now I've got lights on. Give us just a second. Let him fix that. Make everything go over. Okay, I think we're ready. All right, let's start and see what the Bible has to say about the importance of children. And we'll start in Psalm 127, verses 1 to 5. Unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the guards stand watch in vain. In vain you rise early and stay up late, toiling for food to eat, for he grants sleep to those he loves. Children are a heritage from the Lord, offspring a reward from him. Like arrows in the hands of a warrior are children born in one's youth. Blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. Several things in that passage I love, but the thought of children being a blessing from God, and until you have them, you can't understand what a great blessing that is. I like this verse from Isaiah 54, verse 13. All your children will be taught by the Lord, and great will be their peace. The idea here is when we do family God's way, life is much more filled with peace. And how true that is, and we know that to be the case. The emphasis that Jesus gave to children, Mark 9, verse 37, whoever welcomes one of these little ones or little children in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but the one who sent me. And then in Matthew 18, we have that account where Jesus said, let the little children come to me. Don't keep that from happening. And unless you become like a little child, you shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven. And we see Jesus emphasizing the importance of being like little children, but the importance of little children. Now, as we begin tonight's lesson talking about what it's like to be a parent for the first time, I want you to notice what I put on this slide. It is scary to think that parents are given the most important job with virtually no experience. You know, that's kind of crazy, isn't it? You know, it's kind of like coaches in our Little League basketball, baseball, and football, and probably other programs, the times when they need the best coaches early on when they're starting and learning fundamentals, we have people coaching them who don't know nearly as much, and then later when they probably don't need it as much is when they have the better coaches. Well, when it comes to parenting, God hands a life to a person who's never parented before and said, here, take this, figure it out. And for many of us who are parents, we look back on those early days and think, yeah, in fact, it is the case that we didn't know nearly as much as we thought we did. And maybe God doesn't let us realize how in the dark we are until our children are grown. You know what I mean by that? And in fact, how many of us who have had children for a long time, maybe those of us who now have adult children, look back on when we had young children and laugh at some of the things we did, thinking we were doing the right thing? Or am I the only one that feels like that? No, probably not. You know, we look back on those days, and indeed, having and raising children as young adults truly was inexperience and trial and error. Well, the first challenge that I want to talk about tonight as we introduce, in fact, I've got 6 main challenges for parents of young children. And as I get into that, actually before I get into the first one, I want to talk about just an overriding challenge, and that is what to me is the greatest challenge for new parents or for young parents or parents of young children beyond talking about maintaining their relationship with God, which should matter first and foremost in everything we do. Other than that, the most important thing is to maintain a best friend, personal, close relationship between mom and dad, even when children come, and especially when children come. And one of the points that I want to make here, and the way I'll emphasize this, and I'll try to develop this in the next few minutes, but the easy way to develop this is to say there is nothing more important other than teaching our children about God that we can do for them more so than to show them what a good marriage looks like. Because when our children grow up to be adults, they're going to have some concept of what they are looking for. They're going to have some concept of what marriage looks like. They're going to have in their mind what their family should look like. And where do they get that? Where do they get that picture? Where do they get that ideal? Where do they get their thoughts about what they hope to have? Well, we know exactly where they get that. So many times we'll hear daughters talk about how they are looking for someone who's just like their dad. Well, that's not always the case. It shouldn't always be the case, but often it is. Well, why do they do that? Well, because of what I'm talking about in a big way, I believe. And so very important for our marriage to be good so that we teach our children what marriage should look like. Now, I've got several things that I have found, some statements and some quotes as we go, but look at this one from Fortune in May 2016. For around 30 years, researchers have studied how having children affects a marriage, and the results are conclusive. The relationship between spouses suffers once kids come along. Comparing couples with and without children, researchers found that the rate of the decline in relationship satisfaction is nearly twice as steep for couples who have children than for childless couples. In the event that a pregnancy is unplanned, the parents experience even greater negative impacts on their relationship. Now, that's sad, isn't it? That statement is scary to me, but I don't doubt it. I believe it. In fact, 2 years ago when I spoke here, I think the first night I talked about the process of going from the honeymoon to couples coexisting and what a big part having children played in that. Well, I'm going to try to develop that again a little bit in a bit of a different way tonight, but I don't doubt this statement, the results from this study at all. Why? Because the whole dynamic of marriage generally changes in a very significant way when children come along. Now, I also found this statement. New mothers often talk about their social isolation, becoming disconnected from friends and colleagues, and how their world feels like it's shrinking. All of these changes lead to fundamental and long-lasting effects on new mothers' circle of support, including that circle of support or the support that comes from the husband. Well, this is one of those discussions where if you've not been a mother, it's harder to see what's going on here, but if you have been a mother, if you've been a parent, especially a mother, you can relate, I expect, with part of this, because indeed life changes in a very significant way. Found this to be interesting, that today fewer women, maybe because of what we're talking about, are actually having children. And look at how the statement is worded. These downsides, if you want to call them downsides, we'll go along with that for a bit, to having children may partly explain why more and more women in the United States and in fact around the world are choosing not to have children. According to the United States Census, the percent of childless American women from ages 15 to 44 increased a staggering amount in just 2 generations, from 35% in '76 to 47% in 2010. Now, I can explain part of that. Part of that is if you look at the ages 15 to 44, obviously women have children later now than they did a few years ago. That's part of what's going on there. But I think it probably is the case that there are more career women who are choosing not to have children. But I think it may also be that more and more adults realize that adding children to the family dynamic or the marriage changes things significantly. Now look at this statement from Fortune, May 2016. Despite the dismal picture of motherhood, I didn't even like the way that started, do you? But what they're saying is the effect on the marriage and the fact that a lot are not having, more women are not having children. This picture painted by researchers, most mothers and fathers rate parenting as their greatest joy. Much like childbirth, where nearly all mothers believe the pain and suffering was worth it, most mothers believe the rewards of watching their children grow up, and we're going to go back to something I don't like, but look at the underlined section. The rewards of watching their children grow up is worth the cost to their romantic relationship. So what that's saying is, yes, according to the research out there, the toll that children take on the marriage is indeed a significant toll, but it's worth it because of how great it is to have children. Now, I want to tell you that I hate this statement. I don't like the way it looks. I don't like the way it reads. However, from my experience in dealing with marriage and family and in the counseling room, I'm going to tell you I think it's pretty well true. And here's why. Because when children come into the marriage and we love them so much, and that picture that I have described, and I'll show you on the next slide, but that picture 2 years ago that I described to you indeed happens because when children come along, mothers primarily become mothers and dads primarily turn to hobbies and careers for their primary enjoyment, fulfillment in life. And then one day, husbands and wives wake up in a place of coexistence. Now, if we're honest with ourselves, most of us who have had children will say, yes, I see how that happens. I see how that does happen, at least to some degree, in our relationship. And I have worded it, in fact, the next slide, this slide talks about the good news. The good news is our marriage relationship does not have to suffer if we are strategic about it. And look at this process. In fact, I wasn't even close. It was 3 slides later. The process, though, is this. Spouses eventually wake up one day realizing we don't know each other. How many times have I heard in the counseling room, I feel like I don't know you anymore. Or I feel like we don't have anything in common. Sometimes they'll say, we need you to help us because we're having trouble communicating. And usually I'll say, that's interesting. I haven't had any trouble at all communicating with you. You can tell me about your job. You can tell me about your cattle. You can tell me about your children. You can tell me about where you work. Your vocabulary seems fine to me. I have no trouble at all communicating. Well, why do so many couples say we don't know how to communicate with each other? Communication generally is secondary. I'm not going to communicate with somebody I don't want to talk to. And generally the problem is they're not getting along well enough, and because of that they're choosing not to communicate. Not that they have the inability to communicate. Does that make sense? So many times couples wake up many or a few years after children have come along and they have a significant lack of understanding of just why the other one feels the way they do. Why am I so frustrated? Why are they so frustrated? Why did we get here? And indeed, it is the case that so many couples wake up one day just simply coexisting. And as we were driving down tonight, Tina said, make sure you talk about how the empty nest can be a good thing if you prepare for it. If you keep the marriage relationship what it ought to be. And again, remember from a couple of slides ago, my message is, the good news is, while this can happen if we don't guard against it, this allowing our marriage to become weak because of children, again, the good news is it does not have to happen. It doesn't have to be that way. And when we work to not allow that to happen, the empty nest becomes a good thing, not a bad thing. But when moms have grown to so live for their children, and when dads are working and doing their hobbies, and they drift and drift farther and farther apart, and the youngest child goes off to work or to school or leaves home for whatever reason, then you got two people that are living under the same roof that don't really know each other very well. It's kind of like they have a business partnership, a business relationship. They don't have common interests. They don't have a lot of respect for each other because they really just don't have such a relationship that enables them to have that kind of respect. And then it's kind of like, oh, now what are we going to do? Well, I see what generally happens. What happens is mom stays on the phone a lot. And if son or daughter doesn't come home every weekend, mom's liable to be over there in the dorm. I've seen that many, many hundreds of times. And dad may be spending more time out on the lake or the golf course or in the woods or wherever. And them doing something together, just except for maybe coming to church, just almost doesn't happen. But again, the good news is it doesn't have to be that way. So what we're going to talk about for the rest of this topic tonight and probably part of next Wednesday night is what are some of the challenges that are difficult for young parents? And by the way, I had the thought a while ago, we talked quite a bit about marriage. Encourage your neighbors. If they have children, tell them we're talking about parenting. Let them know that these next 3 Wednesday nights after tonight will involve discussion on parenting and encourage them to come. Well, let's look at the first one. Number one, with children come finances, financial issues. Well, that's true, isn't it? You don't have to have children very long before you find out, wow, things are different. Look at some of the differences. First of all, according to the Business Insider from December 2019, pretty recent statistic, the average cost of simply having a baby in the United States is $10,808. Average cost. That is on top of what insurance covers, $10,000. Now, Tina and I didn't pay nearly that much for the delivery. We paid a little more than that through the years for Carter and Haley. I don't know, I don't remember how much we paid. Insurance was better then than it is today. But what about in Tennessee? Well, look at these numbers. Even with insurance, in Tennessee, as of December 2019, a month and a half ago, the normal birth in Tennessee with insurance, in other words, after insurance has paid everything it does, the average out-of-pocket money is $6,817.41. That's a pretty good chunk of change, isn't it? The normal birth without insurance, if you want to know what insurance companies on the average pay, if you don't have insurance, it's going to cost you about $12,000. Do y'all have any idea you were worth that much? Oh, wait, it gets better. We're just getting started. And if the birth delivery was by C-section with insurance, $10,181. Without insurance, that C-section delivery is going to cost over $17,000 on average. Well, yeah, we haven't even gotten them home in their baby beds, and we're already in financial trouble sometimes. Adding a child represents a major financial stress. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, do you trust them? That's where this statistic comes from. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, I'm not sure why they're the ones giving this number, but they say that it costs $233,610 to raise a child today. So, Micah, you got $500,000 sitting there with you. And that number does not even include college. That's through age 17. Now, I'm going to tell you that number to me is inflated, because when I looked at our two, and I kind of yesterday or Monday kind of calculated how much I made at Freed Hardeman for 17 years. I didn't even make $500,000 in 17 years. And so we did it cheaper, but of course that's been a few years ago too. 29 and 31 are their ages now. I remember, in fact, we were talking about this at staff meeting this morning at West Sabbath, and in fact, one of the staff members at West Sabbath, she and her husband are, it looks like, about to adopt a cousin's child, cousin who's been a heroin addict in Memphis, had a baby. The baby's still in the NICU. They're trying to get the baby where she can function being off of the drugs. Sad situation. And so she was telling that Possibly in 4 weeks, they may wind up at the age of 40 with a newborn at home because their hearts are that big. That's who they are. And having this slide fresh on my mind, I inappropriately said, well, let me tell you exactly what that baby's going to cost you. And everybody around the table got on to me for killing the moment for some reason. $233,000. Well, so how do we as new parents deal with the financial differences that come? Financial differences that come. So this is kind of where the rubber meets the road. This is what to emphasize. This is trying to make sense. And whether you agree with those numbers or not, we all will agree, indeed, there are significant financial implications when children come along. Suggestion number one, live on what you make. Live on what you make, and don't rely on credit. That just sounds like something anybody who stands here and talks about finances is going to say. Why? Because it's true. It is absolutely true. I wish that I could just lay all this down and just start talking about the problems that I see in the counseling room that come in families because of people trying to live on more than they make. And how often I hear the word bankruptcy, and how often I hear the word credit card balance, and how often I hear, well, we're not doing so well. And in fact, I have in mind right now a couple that I met with Monday who most of what we talked about was how that they had gotten behind financially and how much stress it puts on their marriage and how difficult it is because they simply for years have not lived on what they make. And oh, how credit cards get in the way. And in fact, I believe, and this is not at all scientific, but I believe that the two things that get more young couples in trouble, and I'm just going to sound like an old fogey by saying this, but it's experience speaking, not necessarily collected data, but I believe that the two things that get more young couples in financial trouble are going out to eat and car payments. Because both of those depreciate down to zero, the first one very, very quickly. But the costs continue for a long time. Now, Haley and Will, 2 or 3 years ago, bought a little house in Nashville, 1,200 square feet. And what they paid for that house is still almost unbelievable to me in Creve Hall. Will coaches at Lipscomb Academy, and Haley teaches over in Antioch, and location-wise and Nashville traffic, it made sense. And they worried about that. And Haley and Will and I talked, and we looked at the numbers, and we talked about whether it was a good idea or not, and it was kind of close. But you know what I told them? Even as careful as I think I am financially, I said, you know what, if you're going to do anything that pushes you a little bit, put your money in real estate. That's going to come back to you at some point. See, when we put money into stuff that's going to depreciate down to zero, and especially if we're paying interest on top of it, especially if it's high interest, it just controls us. It just absolutely controls us. And when we're in the habit of doing that, oh, how many times we wind up in messes. Suggestion number 2, be careful about the I want my child to have more than I had mentality. You know, I think there's some natural desire for all of us to have this. And in fact, I was thinking this morning as I was working on this and continuing to try to develop some of this, I was thinking about whether or not this message will overcome the emotion that is attached in the situation. Now, I'll try to make sense of that. I say every day in the counseling room, emotion is stronger than logic. And if you try to be logical with an emotional person, quit. Doesn't work. Emotion wins every time. That's why when we get mad, we do things that otherwise we would not have done. That's why when somebody is emotional for whatever reason, And the rest of us are looking around going, I don't understand, it doesn't make sense. What are they thinking? Well, logical thought process is not a lot of what's going on there. Does that make sense? Now, how does that fit into this? Man, when you take that little bundle of joy home, and you're sitting there holding something that you had no idea you could love as much as you do immediately, there are all kinds of thoughts and instincts and impulses that you have. And one is, oh, I want this child to have everything they need. I want them to have the best of everything. I want this and I want that. But I want to go ahead and plant a seed that I'll talk about later in the series, and that is this. If we allow that to control our decision making, to the point that we want our children to have the best and have more than we did, and we want things to be easy for them, then we're destroying them. Because when children who don't know how to deal with hardship and difficulty, who don't know how to hear the words no, when they grow up to be adults and they have not had to deal with things that they didn't like, what's going to happen as an adult when they have to deal with things that don't go their way? And what's going to happen when they have hardship? What's going to happen when something unexpected comes and maybe mom and dad are not there to bail them out? And if mom and dad are there to bail them out, well, what are they doing? They're not helping the situation at all. I'll have couples sometimes who will go, I'm so worried about my child. They're in a class at school with a bad teacher, or they're getting picked on at school, and I understand, I don't want my children to be picked on either. I don't like the thought of my grandchildren going to school and maybe getting picked on. Who would like that? But you know what? Sometimes those hardships are the best thing in the world that can happen to us. Why? We better learn how to deal with difficulty. We better learn how to deal with hardship. And if I'm not doing anything else, I want to make this point, and that is we need to be careful that we not have the mindset, oh, I want it just to be perfect for my child, because if it's perfect for that child, then they have problems coming. Suggestion number 3, and this is just look, you guys look at yourselves. If one is a spender and one is a saver, then the one who's the saver needs to be in control more so than the one who's the spender. Now, you may be sitting there going, man, he is so smart for figuring that out. That's not rocket science, is it? It is a very easy thing when you hear a lesson like this, or when you go through a Dave Ramsey class, or where you stop and study and look at what's happening to be logical at that moment. But for the spender, it's very easy for that to wear off in a matter of days. Because we drive by the restaurant and we're hungry and we think, oh, or we go by the car lot and they've got zero financing, zero interest for 6 years or close, and we start thinking foolish thoughts like, wow, that can help me financially. All of these emotional types of buying that spenders do. And I would encourage couples, if one of you is a saver and one of you is a spender, to go home tonight and go, hey, you need to drive this financial boat more than I do. And I'm not talking about a real boat. You need to drive this process more than I do. And sometimes setting up rules is helpful. It is the case that stress piles up when financial pressure increases. And before we go to number 2, I would say it is the case that when children come along, finances will get tighter. And the older they get, the tighter they get. And a big part of that is plan ahead, think ahead about college funds, college days. In fact, let me run with that one just for a second. I have seen over and over again, as much as I love Christian education, it hurts me and bothers me greatly when guy and a girl will meet each other at Freed-Hardeman. When they'll date, 4 years later they become engaged, or 3 years later they become engaged, 4 years later they become married. They get out of Freed-Hardeman with sometimes $200,000 worth of debt, school debt. It's not unusual. I've seen it many, many times for those kids to get out of school with $100,000 school loan debt. And what do they have? Sometimes without a job to pay for it. They've got the equivalent or more of a house payment without a house, without a place to live. Now, if you think that's not burdensome to those kids, and if I still were responsible for Freed Hardeman admissions as I was at one time, I'd probably be kicking myself for saying this. But my point is, we need to be thoughtful. We need to think about what's coming. We need to plan for that. And there's so many different pieces of that puzzle. And if we just kind of think, well, I'll worry about that later because I've got a 1-year-old and he's so far away from college, well, it's going to be here before you know it. If you wait too late, then we'll be controlled by that situation. But let's look at challenge number 2. Number 2, family and household responsibilities when children come along double or more. And generally, so does arguing. Why? Stress levels high. Why? We've never been here before. Things are different. Expectations are different. The number of chores is very different. And how do we allocate who does what? Well, that's usually trial and error. And I put this one in just to cause the women to laugh a little bit. Whose lives change more, or not laugh, but cut the eyes and look. Whose lives change more when children arrive, mothers or fathers? Think about that. That's kind of a no-brainer, isn't it? Every man in here has a guilty look on their face right now. Why? Well, because what tends to happen is we tend to kind of go on with how life has been. And yeah, things change. We have not as much free time. We don't have as much money. We realize she needs us more. But in many cases, he still gets up and goes to work. He comes home and, in fact, I had a couple in the counseling room a couple of weeks ago, and she said, I don't know why he doesn't understand that when he comes home after I've been there with 2 babies, he needs to help me instead of going to the shop. Well, I get that. Most of us do. Why? Because of this mindset that, yeah, things are going to be a little different, but not that different, that we men tend to have. And the women are sitting here right now going, yeah, it's exactly right. Oh, how much help we needed, or how much help we need. And what happens so often, if we men do not understand the need to help, that resentment builds and takes place. And not only do responsibilities increase, but free time to take care of these responsibilities. And then I stopped when I wrote this and I put in parentheses, thinking about the women who said, free time, what's that? What in the world is free time? I remember a little bit when I used to have it. Well, the truth of the matter is there does seem to be no free time. And if husbands come home at the end of a day at work, and moms maybe who have been at home or who have come home from work, and dad says to them, well, what did you do today with your free time? If you want to get hit. Why? Because there's just not much in realizing that. And husbands, fathers, it's so very important for us to realize that we have committed and we want that child and we love that child, and it does change everything, and oh, how important it is to help. Often husbands think moms are not working, those who don't work outside the home anymore, so why don't they have time? Or even more often, are working outside the home and still should be able to do everything. And in fact, one of the secretaries at West 7th who helped me with the PowerPoint presentation read through this, and she stopped at that slide while I was sitting there and we were looking at it together, and she said, oh yeah, nothing's the same. Nothing's the same. And indeed it is not. Well, look at this couple solution. Laundry had to be washed. this mother said, or it stank. And the baby needed to be fed, or he would cry like crazy. The young mother said, recalling the first year with her son, who at the time of writing was 3. So my husband and I started keeping score. Well, I did that, so you do this. And when I saw that statement, I thought about how problematic it is when we start saying, I will if you will. And if we start keeping score in that way, and in fact, if I as a husband think, well, what has she done today? How much should I do based on what she's done? I see all the time that type of mentality is problematic. Well, let's look at the suggestions, and then we'll quit for tonight. First of all, number one, and there are 2 here that are pretty simple. Number one, husbands, try to be attentive. Try to be more helpful, both in terms of time and effort. Be mindful of how draining and how demanding it is on the part of a young mother. But number 2, wives, moms, be appreciative when it happens. Go back to those high school psychology classes when we studied Pavlov and Skinner and realize that if you reinforce desired behavior, the behavior increases. Right? If he finally helps the way you've been wanting him to at the end of a stressful day, what do we want to say? Well, finally. But what we do is push them away in the process. And if you'll appreciate and brag on and let them know how much it helped, the odds of you getting that behavior repeated are far greater. Well, we'll pick up there next week and look at the remaining 4 next week, and then we'll continue. We offer the invitation song tonight. We want to encourage, as we sang a few minutes ago, families that are focused on, centered on, built by God. And if your family is not built around God because you're not living a godly life, because you're not yet a child of His, or you've fallen away, we'd encourage you tonight to come while we stand and sing.